They were called laundries, but they were really prisons. Sanctuaries, they said. But are sanctuaries supposed to make you feel caged? And the women inside them, they weren't criminals. They were not insane. They were our daughters, sisters, mothers, and they tried to erase them. Welcome to Peek into the Dark. I'm Ziska.
And I'm Luna. Before we begin, we have a warning. Today's topic touches on sensitive and disturbing subjects. Some may find them unsettling, even triggering. Listen with care. Please protect your peace. And if you're ready, take our hand and let's begin.
This is the story of the Magdalene Laundries. And it's not ancient history. The last one closed in 1996. Let that sink in. In 1996, we were getting ready to head off to college, choosing new bedding and dorm room decor. Yet in Ireland, the last laundry sanctuary was finally being closed. To fully grasp what was happening at these sanctuary laundries, we have to go back all the way to the beginning, how shame became law. So, how did an entire country, an entire system, turn morality into punishment? Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries were steeped in deep Catholic conservatism, built on foundation of colonial trauma, patriarchal control, and a cultural obsession with female purity. Women's value was measured by silence, submission, and chastity. And the moment a woman stepped out of line by getting pregnant outside of marriage, being too flirtatious, too free, too poor, a victim of sexual assault, or just too loud, she became a threat. In the very beginning, it was offered as if it was a form of charity. Asylums meant to reform the wayward women. By the 19th century, these institutions had spread across Ireland, gaining the blessing and later the full control of the Catholic Church. And with Ireland's deep entanglement between church and state, they flourished. By the time the 20th century began, Magdalene laundries were everywhere. Their purpose? On paper, to rehabilitate fallen women. In practice, to make them disappear. And who were these fallen women? Not criminals, not dangerous. Sometimes they were young girls who had just been sexually abused. Sometimes they were unwed mothers. Sometimes they were orphans or simply too pretty and therefore considered a temptation. Sometimes they were just simply girls who had missed too many school days. Only 3 days or more, to be exact, regardless of the reason. Or they talk back. Sometimes they were just poor. The entrance requirements were low, but once you were inside, escaping was nearly impossible. Families were told that it was for their daughter's own good. Communities turned a blind eye. The state wore invisible blindfolds, and the church, well, the church held the keys. The solution, you ask? Well, it was to simply contain her, break her, and wash the sin from her skin literally. So, religious institutions, mostly Catholic orders, like the Sisters of Mercy, Sisters of Charity, and Good Shepherd Sisters began operating so-called Magdalene asylums. These were named after Mary Magdalene, the repentant prostitute of the Bible.
So they say.
They were founded on a lie that fallen women could be redeemed through hard labor, prayer, and silence.
Okay, so this sounds very similar to like modern day prison reform or the detainment camps that we currently have. All right,
Sounds
gotcha.
exactly like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that redemption never came for these women. What began as places to reform these women and girls turned into dumping grounds for unwed mothers, orphans, rape victims, girls in foster care, abuse survivors, and even rebellious teens whose families just simply didn't want them, and some they simply couldn't afford. You didn't have to commit a crime to end up in these laundries. You just had to be inconvenient. In the eyes of the church, state, or even your family. What went on inside these walls? There was most definitely a system of silence.
Yeah, these walls could talk.
Yeah. The women who entered the laundries were stripped of their names, their hair, their clothes, and their dignities.
Oh my God. So this now sounds like the residential schools that they had for Native Americans.
Mhm.
This is
So
just
it's a
unbelievable.
horrific mixture. We haven't learned from the
And
past.
and is this women only? Is this
Yes, it was young girls, and then well that would eventually grow into women, obviously.
wow. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
They were given new names even, assigned numbers. That sounds familiar, huh?
Mm,
They were no longer daughters. They were no longer people. They reduced to simply labor. So from sunrise to nightfall, they washed laundry for hotels, hospitals, the military, private citizens, and even government departments. They were unpaid, uninsured, and of course, unacknowledged.
sad.
The sound and the smell of water and bleach filled the rooms. The weight of wet sheets cracked their backs and blistered their hands. Silence was mandatory. Eye contact discouraged. Laughter absolutely forbidden. Letters were burned and babies were taken. They lived under a regime of punishment dressed as religion. Some were beaten, some were starved, some even locked in solitary confinement for days. Many were sexually abused by priests or by the very nuns who claimed to save them.
Mm,
And when they bled, they worked. When they begged, they were mocked. They were told over and over, "You are dirty. You are unworthy. You are here to suffer. It is God's will." All under the mantra of penance. They were told this labor was their path to forgiveness. But forgiveness for what? Being raped? Becoming pregnant out of wedlock? For being mentally ill? Or for being homeless? Or being inconvenient? Or was it for simply being born a female? The truth is, many didn't know why they were there, and many never left. But it wasn't divine justice, it was state sponsored misogyny because the Irish government knew from the 1920s through the 1990s, the state directly referred women to the laundries. It funded them. It sent orphans and juvenile detainees to them. It paid religious orders for each head, which is a person, they held captive. There were no trials, no appeals, no exit strategies. What began as a punishment became industry.
It sounds an awful like these private funded prisons.
Mhm. And the church profited off this unpaid labor.
Mm.
The state saved money by letting nuns handle women that they didn't want to care for. Hospitals, hotels, and government offices sent their laundry to be washed in the Magdalene machines. Clothes reeked of bleach, sheets scrubbed until blood disappeared, but the shame didn't. That stayed buried. What became of the mothers that were sent to this place? The mothers they erased. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this horror is the fate of the women who gave birth inside these institutions, or the ones who just gave birth and were sent there with babies in tow. Well, they wouldn't be kept together for very long. Young girls, pregnant from grape, incest, or from lovers who abandoned them, some as young as 12. These mother and baby homes, often operated by the same religious orders, took the newborns from them, sometimes within hours of delivery. They were told that their babies had died. Some were simply told that they were too unfit to be a mother within hours of having their baby. In many cases, the children were sold, trafficked to America in illegal adoptions, often with forged documents. The mothers were sent to the laundries as punishment for their sin, to atone, to forget about their baby. I just don't get how they thought that they would forget about their baby. In these laundries, there were many reports of deaths in the washroom. It became a well documented fact that some women died there. They would be buried in unmarked graves under stones etched with false memories or only numbers, and their families would never be alerted. They went as far as listing these women and children as escapees, even though they had
Wow.
been buried on the premises. That was a system of silence at work.
Mm-hmm. Of course. So in 1993, the truth literally surfaced when 155 bodies were discovered in a mass grave behind a convent in Dublin. The public outcry began, but it wasn't nearly loud enough. No one wanted to speak. Several people knew the truth, but the system of silence protected the powerful. I think we all know how familiar this sounds.
Yeah.
In the aftermath, some would claim freedom. However, there was no true freedom. For those who did get out, freedom became synonymous with shame. The women who left the laundries were rarely welcomed back by their families. They had no money, no education, no social support. They were shunned and they were considered branded. Many would never marry. Many would never have children. They would never speak of their past. Some turned to sex work in order to survive. Some turned to drugs. And some were lost by their own hand. Many would disappear again, and few would go on to live quietly until they didn't. The system of silence would be shattered, and some began to speak of the horrors that happened to themselves and others under the guise of charity and by the orders of the church. Here are some of the echoes from the walls of the Magdalene laundries. As a living altar, we want to provide some of the survivor testimonies. These are not just abstract stories from the past. These are their voices of the women who lived it. You were scrubbed down like you were contaminated. My clothes were taken. I had a number, not a name. The nun who cut my hair said, "Now we'll see if boys still want you." I didn't know what I had done wrong. Mary Smith entered at age 13. They told me I was no good and that my baby would be better off without me. I scrubbed floors pregnant. They made me give birth alone. I begged for help, but they said that pain would teach me. Margaret Bullen from the Irish Times interview. The nun watched me bleed through my dress as I ironed for hours. She said it was punishment for vanity. We weren't allowed to look in mirrors, and if you cried, you were beaten. Testimony from Justice for Magdalene's Submission. I was put in a punishment cell for 3 days for speaking. It had no light, no blanket, just concrete. They said I could pray in silence or rot. I was 16, unidentified survivor from the McAleese report. I searched for my son my entire life. They told me I'd signed him away. I hadn't. They forged my name. I still remember the look on his face when they took him from me, from my arms. Philomena Lee. We weren't human. We were labor. We weren't supposed to be heard or remembered. They said work was our redemption. But all I did was cry into my sheets at night. Maria Teresa Collins. Here are some horrific, detailed, documented facts from the McAleese report in 2013. Over 30% of women entered before the age of 18. Many were referred without consent of their parents. That would come from the priests or the state institutions. Daily punishments included food deprivation, forced silence, and solitary confinement. Women were denied contact with the outside world and were forbidden from knowing when or even if they would be released. Those who died were often buried in mass graves, and their families were never notified. Mothers were forced to give their children up for adoption, and many never saw them again. Girls as young as 12 were sent in for being, quote, troublesome or, quote, too pretty. Many were victims of abuse. Many were kept for decades, and some for their entire lives. These are not isolated accounts. These are the collective memories of Ireland's forgotten daughters, now our reclaimed and remembered daughters. And the silence they endured has now become the testimony we must all continue to carry. In the early 2000s came the reckoning, or what was meant to be anyway. Ireland began peeling back the veil on its past, but only partway. In 2013, after decades of denial, the McAleese report finally emerged. It confirmed everything survivors had been screaming into the void for years. The abuse was real. The state was complicit, and lives had been shattered beyond repair. The Taoiseach, the prime minister at the time, Edna Kenny, stood before the nation and gave a formal apology. And for a heartbeat, it felt like the silence might break. but no apologies could erase the graves. They don't undo the trauma. They don't return the stolen children. And what's left now? Well, there's ruins, cold stone walls, fading documents, and names whispered like secrets. And above all, the need to remember not just what happened, but why it was allowed, why shame became law, why purity was turned into a weapon, why survival meant silence. They called these women fallen, but it was the institutions that fell into cruelty, into corruption, into sin. And yes, there were apologies, but justice? No, that's complicated. The report counted over 10,000 women locked away, but survivors say the number was much higher and that too many voices were erased from the record. Compensation? Some saw it, but many never did.
Mm-hmm.
Records? Many were lost or locked away. And then the Catholic Church. Not a single cent in reparations. The orders who ran these laundries, the Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of Charity, the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity, or the Good Shepherd Sisters, well, they expressed sorrow, but never shouldered the full weight of what they'd done. And still, survivors fight. Some still search for their children. Some still lie in unmarked graves. This wasn't a reckoning. It was a crack in the wall, and behind it, the darkness remains. This was never just Ireland's story. Don't mistake this for a tragedy that was contained within the Irish borders. It wasn't. The Magdalen Laundries lived in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, and yes, in the United States. Anywhere the church intertwined with the state, these systems took root. Anywhere patriarchy wrapped itself in the language of piety, they flourished. And the echoes, they're still here. In foster systems that stripped children from their parents, in forced sterilizations, in abortion bans, in the way society still punishes women who refuse to fit a mold it never asked men to wear. These aren't relics, they're reflections. So, what do we do with all of this? As a final vow of a memory as defiance, we remember because the Magdalen Laundries were not ancient, they were not folklore, and they were not accidents. They were systems built on power. They were fed by silence. They were dismantled only by the courage of those who refused to be erased. We owe it to the women, the forgotten daughters of Ireland, to speak their names, tell their truth, and shatter the spell of secrecy that made it possible. To the ones who never made it out, we carry you. To the ones still waiting for justice, we stand with you. And to the ones who still don't know where their children were taken, we will not stop asking. Because forgetting would be the final cruelty. And we were never meant to forget. You have been listening to Peek into the Dark. And as we close tonight, we want you to remember the Magdalen Laundries weren't just a chapter in Ireland's history. They were a warning, a blueprint of what happens when shame is turned into law, when morality is dictated by power, and when women's bodies are treated as battlegrounds. We tell ourselves it couldn't happen again, but look closely and you'll see the patterns forming. In courtrooms, in legislation, in the way that society still polices women who dare to step outside the roles it has written for them. The Magdalene survivors fought for their dignity, their truth, and their place in the record. Women today are still fighting for the same things: the right to be heard, the right to be believed, and the right to decide what happens to our own bodies. Remember their names, remember their stories, and remember, women's rights are never permanently won. They are defended every single day. Until next time, keep your eyes open to the dark, because the dark is always watching back.